Hello, my name is Jaru. Today I'm talking about Deltarune. There will be major spoilers for both Deltarune and Undertale, so please play them both before watching this. Today I will be analyzing one of the most fascinating, tragic, and popular characters in Deltarune, Spamton G. Spamton. However, since Spamton is such a hugely complex character to analyze, I will be splitting this analysis into several videos. Today's video will be part 1, and it will be focused on exploring the story and themes of Spamton's life. Spamton's story is shrouded in mystery, but we know enough about him to weave a coherent and compelling narrative. Rest assured that while I will be presenting his story with my usual dramatic flair, I won't be adding any speculation without clarifying that I'm adding speculation. And just to be certain that I'm portraying Spamton's story correctly, I will always have the source for whatever part of his story I'm currently discussing on screen at the time. After retelling his story, I will then discuss the very fascinating themes and morals that Toby Fox seems keen on emphasizing with this character. And just to be clear, the future parts of this project will be where I focus on actually solving Spamton's mysteries and providing my own theories. This video is simply a literary analysis. That said, there's a lot of deep, emotional, and beautiful things to be found in Spamton's story, so I'd still suggest watching this video even if it's not focused on theory crafting. Oh, and before I forget, I have a Patreon now, so if you'd like to throw some money my way, I'd greatly appreciate it. Without further ado, let's dive into the dark, tragic, and extremely engaging story of Spamton G. Spamton. Once upon a time, within a section of the Dark Realm known as the Cyberworld, there was a particular variety of Darkner known as the Addisons. As their name would imply, these fellows are the premier advertisers within Cyber City, with each one being an expert salesman. With their bright colors, stylish V-necks, and long pointed noses, you'd be hard-pressed to mistake them for anyone else. However, amongst the Addisons, there was one Darkner who didn't quite fit in. While he had the same trademark V-neck, he lacked the iconic green pants, was far shorter, and had a longer nose. But make no mistake, the peculiar appearance was only the tip of the iceberg when it came to this very odd man. This is Spamton. Like all Addisons, he was a salesman. But unlike the others, Spamton never quite had any luck in his business, as his products never seemed to sell. However, despite his misfortunes, Spamton kept his spirits high, and when hanging out with the other Addisons, he would often insist that one day he'd make it big. "You just watch. Someday I'm gonna be a big shot." At a glance, you might make the mistake of thinking Spamton's dream was to achieve great wealth or fame, but for him, it was more than that. He didn't really want money or popularity or even power. All he wanted was freedom. The freedom to call his own shots. The freedom to choose his own destiny. This dream would be the driving motivator behind everything he would go on to do, as he was truly determined to make that dream a reality. However, things would get worse for Spamton before they got better. As his business continued to flounder, he started getting desperate, and he became willing to try anything to find success. This led to him making contact with a mysterious entity on the phone. It's unknown if Spamton contacted this entity by chance, or if this entity reached out to him. But either way, this would turn out to be the big break Spamton had been waiting for. This person on the phone started helping Spamton in some major ways, as Spamton suddenly became far more successful in his business. The other Addisons noticed that he was on the phone all the time, presumably with this mysterious benefactor. Whatever aid this entity provided proved to be extremely impactful as Spamton rose to unprecedented levels of fame and fortune. The Addisons, jealous at Spamton's newfound success, stopped hanging out with him, leaving Spamton with no other companion except the mysterious entity on the phone. Little did they know, this abandonment by his fellow Addisons would have far-reaching consequences. However, in the meantime, Spamton's success was meteoric, and he was soon granted a room in the Queen's mansion. The room he was given was the same room that would later be given to a Lightner, and Lightners are regarded as gods by Darkners, so to be given the same honor as a Lightner just further demonstrates how much of a big shot Spamton had become. He was involved in big TV deals, big cars, and big commercials. Everything seemed to be going incredibly well for Spamton. All his dreams had finally come true. But then, something changed. The specifics are unknown, but to outsiders, it seemed like whatever had been helping him find success disappeared. And without the aid of the mysterious entity, Spamton's career soon came crashing down around his ears. That said, this collapse did not happen all at once, and there was a notable period of time during this disaster in which he still lived in the Queen's mansion, and it was around this time that he discovered something that would be integral to his future. Down in the basement of the mansion, where the corrupted data was stored, Spamton stumbled across something incredible, an artifact of some kind. It's uncertain exactly what this artifact was, and it's also unknown how Spamton learned of its existence, but what we do know is that Spamton became obsessed with it. As his career fell apart, Spamton began spending more and more time in the basement. What was he doing down there? Well, according to the butlers who were there at the time, Spamton would spend hours on end praying in front of this artifact, and the butlers theorized that Spamton thought this relic may hold the secret to his next big break. Unfortunately, Spamton did not seem to find what he was looking for in time, and soon he was evicted from his room at the mansion and kicked out on the street. On the day of his eviction, he begged them to stop taking away his furniture, but it was to no avail. These butlers and other high society folks were not his friends. They may have treated him well when he was wealthy and successful, but now that he was down on his luck, he was no longer a valued customer, and was not worth their time. Just to add insult to injury, they struck his name from their records, and when they sold his bow ties in their stores, they would make sure to rip off Spamton's name from the label. Very cruel. On that final day in the mansion, it's believed Spamton had one last intense phone call with the mysterious entity, and Spamton seemingly walked away from the call mid-conversation, as the entity could still be heard talking on the other end. We can only speculate what was said between them, but given Spamton left mid-conversation, and given that his life had collapsed around him, we can only assume that he and the phone entity had not parted on good terms. But now, without any financial support, the high society discarding him, and with all the Addisons having abandoned him out of jealousy, Spamton was left homeless, hopeless, and utterly alone. The best time of Spamton's life had come to an abrupt end, and now it was time for tragedy. You see, Spamton didn't just lose his apartment and his job during all this. No, his suffering was far worse than that. At some point, we don't quite know when, something terrible happened to Spamton's mind. His speech had become incoherent and garbled, with advertisements and sales slogans forcing their way into his every sentence. His mood became dangerously erratic, with him being overwhelmingly high energy and aggressive one moment, only for him to suddenly collapse into a subdued, bitter depression the very next. If that weren't bad enough, Spamton's grip on reality became very tenuous, to the point that he'd scream at people who aren't even there, or randomly get lost in his own dark memories, completely ignoring the reality around him in the process. To say that Spamton was now suffering from extreme mental illness would be a severe understatement. There are many factors that could have contributed to his mind becoming fractured like this. His only friends had deserted him. His mysterious ally on the phone had seemingly hung him out to dry, and his one dream of becoming a big shot had been torn away from him, and he was now left homeless, literally sleeping in dumpsters. All this could have been what caused his mental collapse, but one cannot help but wonder if the mysterious entity played a larger role in Spamton's mental decline. Had it done something or said something that traumatized Spamton this badly? Did this strange artifact stored with the corrupted data play some role in his illness? It's hard to say. Whatever the cause may have been, Spamton's life had been thoroughly ruined, and after being betrayed by every friend and ally he had ever known, Spamton's fractured psyche was then filled with hatred, bitterness, and regret. However, this was not the end for Spamton. You see, there is one thing you need to know in order to truly understand Spamton. One attribute he possesses that rests at the core of his character. Spamton G. Spamton, more than anything else, is defined by his unwillingness to give up, his refusal to back down, his dedication to his dream. In other words, Spamton is defined by his perseverance. When his business failed, he never stopped trying new things. When his phone ally abandoned him, he never stopped looking for his next big break. And when all of society had turned on him and forced him to live in the dump, even this wasn't enough to stop Spamton from chasing his dream. He may have suffered some psychological damage along the way, but even in the midst of his mad ravings, a driving intelligence clearly still motivates him. That all said, while Spamton's dream of freedom still burned brightly in his heart, his strategy for achieving that freedom had undergone a notable shift. Before now, he had believed that he could achieve freedom through wealth and fame, but his experience now showed him that this was not a viable pathway. Wealth could be stripped away. Popularity could vanish in the blink of an eye. If he wanted the true, lasting freedom to pursue his own destiny, he would need something more concrete, something nobody could take away from him. Spamton needed power. Power that could not be rivaled. And somehow, some way, he had come up with a plan to acquire that very thing. Hidden within the Queen's basement was an old machine that wielded terrifying power, and Spamton had discovered a way to fuse himself with this robotic body. It's likely that Spamton knew about this old machine during his time at the mansion, and while not confirmed, the artifact he spent all his time praying in front of was likely this very machine. And now that he had figured out how to fuse with it, all he needed to do was sneak back into the mansion and get down into the basement. However, this would prove a lot easier said than done, as the Queen's mansion was very well guarded. This next period of Spamton's life was dominated first and foremost by his many attempts at breaking into the mansion. And while we don't know about all his various efforts, we do know about a few of them. Once, Spamton tried impersonating Swatch, the Queen's head butler. That's why Spamton wears a completely black and white outfit with multicolored glasses. Prior to this plan, Spamton likely had an outfit that more closely resembled the other Addisons, as evidenced by these posters showing Spamton without his iconic glasses. Regardless, impersonating Swatch obviously failed, as Spamton looked nothing like the butler. But it just goes to show how far his mind had fallen that he thought this plan was even remotely feasible. The next plan that we know about came sometime after the Roaring Night created the Dark Fountain, as it was during this period that the Queen became more tyrannical, and more Darkners started to openly rebel against her. One such group of rebels was the Sweet Cap'n Cakes, who Spamton tried to hire to sneak into the mansion. However, this plan never got off the ground, as the Sweet Cap'n Cakes refused to accept the job because, and I quote, "We're just rebels, we don't want to get in trouble." These are the only known attempts Spamton made to infiltrate the mansion, although it's entirely feasible that he tried and failed at a number of other plans too. The exact timeline here is unclear, but given that the butlers talk about Spamton like he was a long-forgotten figure, it's quite possible that Spamton spent years, or maybe even decades, living in the dumpsters of Cyber City, desperately trying to pursue his mad plan. This, of course, means that we now have to add years upon years of failed break-ins on top of all of Spamton's other failures. I cannot overemphasize just how much perseverance Spamton had to possess to stay so devoted to his dream in spite of so many painful setbacks. It is at this point in the story that we finally reach the events of Deltarune Chapter 2. The decrepit salesman, after a lifetime of misfortune, finally seemed to have a stroke of luck, as one day, seemingly out of nowhere, a lightener showed up right outside one of his dumpsters. Spamton, even as deranged as he had become, could clearly see an opportunity here. A lightener would have a much better chance of getting into the mansion than any darkener, so he desperately began trying to convince this strange blue person to help him in his plan. However, as Spamton soon realized, this was no ordinary lightener. There was something different about this one, something familiar. Whether due to his madness or just plain old empathy, Spamton seemed to relate to this lightener on a fundamental level. Even with them hardly speaking, Spamton was able to tell that this lightener, this Chris, was a kindred spirit. Someone who was also suffering under the heel of a cruel world. Someone who had the same dream as him. Someone who desperately wanted freedom. After inviting Chris back to his shop in the dump, Spamton further demonstrated just how much he valued Chris, as he states outright that he and Chris are already fast friends, and that they don't need anyone else. It's at this point that you start to realize the parallels between these two figures. Both considered freaks and outsiders, both struggling for freedom, and both incredibly lonely. It's no wonder that Spamton projects himself onto Chris in much of his dialogue, as the two really are cut of seemingly similar cloth. After some conversation, Spamton makes his request of Chris. He asks them to go into the basement, retrieve an empty disc from the old machine, and bring it back here. Chris obliges. They do exactly as Spamton requested, and Spamton, overjoyed, uploads himself onto the disc. Chris then takes the disc back to the machine and puts it in. After years of struggles, years of planning, and years of suffering, Spamton, through sheer perseverance, had achieved his goal. And thus was Spamton Neo born. By acquiring the power of this old machine, Spamton instantly became the single most powerful entity in the Cyber City, and easily the most powerful Darkener that Chris had ever seen. Finally, Spamton had real power. Finally, he could realize his dream. Finally, he could be free. Or rather, that's what Spamton had thought. Mere moments after acquiring this new form, Spamton realized it wasn't enough. He still wasn't free. He was still, as he put it, just a puppet on strings. It's unclear whether Spamton is referring to the literal wires powering his new body, or if he's referring to more metaphorical strings. Whatever the case, the result is the same. He had failed again. Even with all this power, he wasn't truly free. But, as is the way of Spamton, he still didn't give up. If this much power wouldn't do it, then he'd need more. And sitting right in front of him was Chris, who, within their small, fragile body, contained the incredible power of a human soul. Spamton, in the first truly evil act that we ever see him commit, turns on his only friend. Spamton, in his madness, insists that he's doing this for both of their sakes. He insists that by giving him their soul, they will both become big shots. They will both become free. However, before he can follow through with this, Chris is rescued by their friends, and a fierce battle between Spamton Neo and the Delta Warriors commences. However, even while fighting to the death, Spamton never stops talking to Chris. He continues to try everything he can to persuade Chris to join him. He pulls out every salesman tactic he has to try and sell Chris on this insane plan. And what is perhaps his most insane line yet, he tells Chris that he can't force them, echoing his line from their first encounter. Even now, even while trying to murder Chris and steal their soul, Spamton still finds the idea of forcing Chris to be abhorrent. He finds the idea of taking away Chris's freedom unacceptable. Spamton's mind is so warped that he can't comprehend that stealing Chris's soul is forcing them, which only makes this fight all the more tragic. In his own twisted way, Spamton really does seem to care about Chris, but any value he places on their friendship is squashed under the weight of Spamton's madness and his own obsession with achieving his dream. Even so, if there's one fact that you can always count on, it is this: Spamton will always fail. That is his destiny, and that is exactly what happens here. As the Delta Warriors cut Spamton's wires bit by bit, attempting to disable him without killing him, they eventually whittle him down to one last cord. At this point, Spamton concludes that they are actually trying to help free him from his puppet strings and is touched by their act of friendship. And in a moment that demonstrates Spamton's mad character perfectly, he cuts his own cord in the name of friendship and freedom, defeating himself in the process. This was the final straw for Spamton. He had tried so hard for so long to achieve his dream, and he had failed at every opportunity. Even becoming Neo had failed miserably. And while Spamton was defined by his perseverance, even he could only suffer so many failures before losing hope. And this final defeat was too much for his little heart to bear. Cracks had been forming in Spamton's mind for a long time, and now, after everything, his spirit had been broken entirely. The world had beaten Spamton down his entire life, and now he was done fighting back. In his final moments, all his energy spent, Spamton seemed to regain some semblance of his sanity as his speech became clear and comprehensible for the first time in a long time. It seems, after all, I couldn't be anything more than a simple puppet. But you three, you're strong. With a power like that, maybe you three can break your own strings. let me become your strength. In his final sane act, Spamton chose to give what power he could to the only real friend he'd ever made, the only person who seemed to truly understand his plight. And so, the story of Spamton G. Spamton comes to a close. A simple man with a simple dream who, in the pursuit of that dream, was abandoned, betrayed, broken, and forsaken by his friends, partners, allies, and world. A tragedy, to be sure, but a very nuanced tragedy. From a storytelling perspective, there are many interesting and engaging themes within Spamton's story that contribute to him being such a memorable character. And while I could never cover them all, I would like to draw attention to the 3 themes I found to be the most interesting and meaningful. The most obvious of these themes, and the one that's most important to Deltarune's overarching narrative, is that of freedom. Spamton's main goal in his story, from start to finish, is to achieve freedom. And while the exact nature of this freedom changes, the reason he wants it stays the same. He wants to choose his own destiny, and he is willing to do anything to achieve this. This hunger for freedom is what draws him and Chris together, as they too desire freedom from the one pulling their strings. Even though Chris has no real agency, that doesn't stop them from empathizing with Spamton. And after seeing Spamton fail miserably in his own quest, this rather clearly has an impact on Chris. In the conversation after fighting Spamton Neo, no matter which answer you give to this question, Chris's true feelings shine through, causing Ralsei and Susie to take note of Chris being uncharacteristically upset. With the greater context of Spamton's story, it's quite easy to tell why Chris would be so disturbed. Spamton's entire purpose in life, the goal that he had been pursuing for decades, was to gain freedom. And yet, even with that single-minded devotion, Spamton still failed. If someone as devoted to their dream as Spamton still failed to achieve freedom, then what chance could Chris possibly have? This realization is, in my opinion, a big part of why Chris is so upset. They are terrified that they too will end up just like Spamton, a puppet unable to cut its own strings. Speaking of which, Spamton actually draws comparisons between himself and Pinocchio, saying, "My days as a long-nosed doll are over. Cut that wire and make me a real boy." This is a very interesting parallel for Toby Fox to draw, as it showcases how Spamton's story is, in many ways, the exact opposite of Pinocchio's. Pinocchio starts his story as a lifeless puppet on strings, but after being granted life and overcoming several obstacles, the puppet grows and becomes more human, with his story culminating in him becoming a real boy. Contrast this with Spamton. He started out believing he was a real man with real agency, but as his life went on, he started to realize that his freedom wasn't as real as he had thought. This propelled him to pursue true freedom, to become a real boy, so to speak. And much like Pinocchio, Spamton was forced to confront many challenges. He struggled to find success as a salesman, which forced him into the waiting clutches of the person on the phone, who then seemed to promise Spamton the chance to have all his wildest dreams come true, only for that same phone person to abandon him at the last minute. This is fascinatingly similar to the part of Pinocchio's story, where he too is manipulated by a devilish figure into visiting a magical land of freedom and fun, only for that figure to betray the puppet later on. And of course, after being abandoned, Spamton had to struggle to get back into the mansion. However, the big difference here between Spamton and Pinocchio is that Pinocchio's trials ultimately benefited the young doll, who became a stronger and better person with each obstacle he overcame. By contrast, Spamton did not benefit from the struggles he faced. Quite the opposite. The challenges Spamton faced, rather than make him stronger, only served to make him more damaged. Each obstacle just made him lose more and more of himself. First, he lost his friends, then he lost his wealth and fame, then he lost his mind, and finally, he lost his agency altogether, reduced to a literal puppet on strings. Pinocchio is about a puppet gaining life, humanity, and freedom by becoming a real person, while Spamton's story is about a real person losing everything until he is reduced to a broken husk dangling from strings. It's a rather clever bit of writing, I must say, and I especially appreciate how the theme of freedom is utilized to compare and contrast Spamton with another major character in Deltarune. I am of course referring to Jevil. Jevil, like Spamton, was a powerful secret boss, so comparisons between the two are inevitable. But what's interesting is how Toby Fox intentionally draws attention to their differences in this story. At several points, people mention how some unspecified big shot hated clowns, and Spamton himself repeatedly rants about the clown around town. This comparison between Jevil and Spamton leads us to one of the most interesting narrative dichotomies within Deltarune, as both of these characters exist to tackle the idea of freedom. Jevil repeatedly mentions how he's the only free one, and he promises to show the heroes what it means to be free in their battle. In his backstory, Jevil, much like Spamton, had an encounter with a mysterious entity who, seemingly, drove Jevil mad. This encounter convinced Jevil that life was just a meaningless game, and that the only real meaning to it was to have fun. The narrative Toby Fox seems to be weaving here is that Jevil, when confronted with the reality that his choices don't matter and that he doesn't really have any freedom, took this news rather well, and used this revelation to justify him doing whatever he wanted. After all, if he has no real agency, then he can do whatever he wants without consequences. The buck does not stop with him, so why worry? Jevil felt liberated by this revelation. I believe that's why he says he's the only free one. I don't think he believes he's actually free, but rather, by coming to terms with his lack of real freedom, he is freed from the bondage of morality, society, and everything else. He is free to do whatever he wants, with one of his voice lines literally him saying, "I can do anything." By realizing he has no true freedom, he is able to achieve a sort of internal freedom, which he cherishes. This is the complete opposite of Spamton. Spamton, upon realizing he had no freedom, proceeded to devote every waking second of his life to finding freedom. To him, having no freedom was a nightmare. Without freedom, he couldn't do or be anything. Everything becomes meaningless if freedom was a lie, so to him, chasing freedom was a necessity. This contrast between these characters' worldviews is reflected in their behavior. While both of them are somewhat insane, Jevil is quite happy, while Spamton is intensely unhappy. Jevil has come to terms with his bondage, while Spamton rages against the one pulling his strings. Jevil finds liberty in his lack of meaning, while Spamton finds nothing but despair. This meme literally summarizes their difference in worldview perfectly. This dichotomy very effectively showcases the two extremes one can go to when confronted with the idea of your choices not mattering, which is what I think Toby Fox was going for. On one end, you have Spamton, who fights tooth and nail for freedom his entire life. While on the other end, you have Jevil, who not only accepts the hand he has been dealt, but also outright revels in it. I think this is why Spamton hates him. Jevil revels in what Spamton considers outright slavery, which infuriates him. Notably, neither of these characters seem to be considered in the right by Toby Fox, as they are both antagonists that are shunned by the majority of characters. But establishing the incorrect responses to this theme is necessary if Toby Fox wants to provide a correct interpretation later on. It's impossible to know what Toby Fox has in store for the future secret bosses, but if he continues the trend of having each secret boss confront this theme of freedom, then I'm going to guess that these future bosses will fall somewhere between the philosophical extremes established by Spamton and Jevil. I think Toby Fox gave us these two characters as our first secret bosses because he wanted to establish the two extreme ends of this spectrum before using future bosses to flesh out the more moderate philosophical stances between them. This is just a small prediction on my part, I could be wrong, but it makes a lot of sense from a narrative perspective if Toby Fox intends to further delve into this particular theme. There's one last element of this freedom theme that I think warrants attention, because it seems to demonstrate a particular stance Toby Fox himself has on this topic. You see, Spamton isn't the only instance in which Toby Fox has written a narrative based around the pursuit of freedom. In fact, Toby made an entire game with this as its focus. I am of course referring to Undertale. In this game, everyone in the kingdom is seeking freedom, with nearly every monster desperately praying for some way to escape their underground prison. Even the story of Frisk is, ultimately, about them seeking freedom from the underground. However, quite notably, the story of Undertale went very differently from the story of Spamton. In Undertale, the general consensus is that freedom is inevitable. They even have a prophecy confirming that one day an angel will set them free. Of course, some interpret this freedom to be the freedom of death, but still, the overall narrative still supports this notion that freedom will come. The monsters even fully gain their freedom in one of the endings, supporting the notion that freedom is not only possible, but achievable. And if you focus your attention purely on Frisk, they always achieve freedom by the end of the game. No matter which route you are on, they will always escape the underground. This is quite different from Spamton, who never achieves freedom no matter which route you take. In every timeline, Spamton fails. This, of course, raises the question, why? From a narrative thematic standpoint, why does Spamton fail? If I was Toby Fox and I wanted to tell a story and prove a point about the nature of freedom and what it takes to earn freedom, then why would I have the Undertale characters succeed while Spamton always fails? In other words, what do the Undertale characters do correctly in Toby Fox's eyes that Spamton does incorrectly? Keep this question in mind, as I'll be wrapping back around to it in a little bit. The second major theme of Spamton's story, and the theme that most majorly impacted me personally, was the theme of societal neglect. Something that really struck me about Spamton's downward arc is that it really wasn't his fault. Throughout his entire story, he's just doing what's expected of him, and yet he's constantly punished for it. He's an Addison, so he became a salesman, as that's what's expected of Addisons. He enthusiastically did his job, too, so nobody can claim he wasn't giving it his all. And yet, his business failed. Why did it fail? Was it because he was bad at his job? Well, no. The other Addisons state that the only difference between them and him was that Spamton was unlucky. Right out the gate, Spamton is suffering because of the job he was born into. But what came next was far more cruel. Not only was Spamton being punished by his industry, even though he was doing everything correctly, but when he finally found success with the help of the mysterious phone entity, he was punished for that too. The other Addisons, instead of celebrating the success of their friend, were filled with jealousy. Instead of viewing this as Spamton being rewarded for his hard work, they viewed him as unworthy. As a result, every single Addison turned their back on him and left Spamton without a single real friend. This moment, this abandonment by the Addisons, is, in my opinion, the moment that doomed Spamton. Throughout his story, his suffering would have been greatly alleviated if he had even a single friend there to give him some support. If even a single one of his allies or co-workers had actually shown any real compassion to the man, this whole tragic story could have been averted. If the Addisons had been there for him when he fell from grace, or if one of the butlers had given him a little bit of help, or if anyone had stepped in to give Spamton a place to stay after being evicted, then his developing mental illness could have been curtailed. Instead, everyone just turned a blind eye. And to be clear, this isn't them forgetting Spamton exists and not realizing he needs help. Everyone knew the truth. The butlers knew what Spamton was going through, as they had to keep him from invading the mansion all the time. The Addisons knew what he was going through, as they all show up in the dump after you defeat Spamton Neo. That means not only did they know what Spamton was going through, but they even knew where he lived. They knew he was living in dumpsters like an animal, and yet they did nothing. However, what's especially frustrating is that there is no single villain who can be blamed for Spamton's downfall, because no single person did anything particularly cruel to him. They all contributed in small ways, but when looked at in isolation, these contributions don't seem all that villainous. Unfriending your coworker out of jealousy is not kind, but it's not your responsibility to be friends with everyone you meet. Evicting a tenant who hasn't paid rent is not kind, but you're just enforcing the lease agreement. It's not your fault he took an apartment he couldn't afford. Establishing a capitalist economy that allows random chance to leave people homeless on the street, again, is not kind, but you can't really blame Queen for allowing a system that most of society is comfortable with. Even the phone entity can't truly be marked as acting villainous here. This entity gave Spamton a hand when he was struggling, and while it's not kind to abandon someone, it's also not your responsibility to support an entrepreneur if you don't want to. Do you see what the problem is? It's not that these people are villains who stole Spamton's happiness. They're just ordinary people who stood idly by while his life fell apart. They felt no moral obligation to help him, so they didn't. Now, I'm gonna get a bit real for a moment. The reason that this story of societal neglect hits so hard for me is because it is so true to life. In the United States alone, there are 32 million people living in poverty, and over 500,000 of those people are homeless. Despite being in the most wealthy country in the world by a huge margin, we allow all these people to live in despair. And yet, who is to blame? Who can we point the finger at to hold responsible for this suffering? Sure, it's easy to point our fingers at the politicians and the elite, but when we're done ranting at them for their cruelty, what do? Nothing. We don't actually try to fix the problem. We just complain about the issue and then move on. We assume it's someone else's responsibility to help these people. Here's an example. How many times have you, in your car driving home, found yourself stopped at a stoplight, and out of the corner of your eye, you see someone standing on the side of the road? They're dressed in old, worn-out clothes, they look haggard and unkempt, and they're holding up a cardboard sign begging for any scrap of money or food that you can spare. And you, sitting in your air-conditioned car, listening to Spotify, proceed to avert your gaze and pretend you didn't see them. It's too sad to cope with, so you pretend it didn't happen. As soon as that light turns green, you gun it and get away from that person as fast as possible. You go home, eat some food, watch some Netflix, and play some games before going to sleep in your bed. All memory of that sad, destitute person pushed from your mind. After all, you've got a life to live. You've got a job to do. You don't have time to feel bad about every sob story in the world, right? You tell yourself this to feel better. All the while, that same sad person scavenges in the trash for food before sleeping under a bridge or in a dirty alleyway. On some days, if you happen to have the spare change and are in the right mood, you may generously decide to give that homeless person a couple dollars, and then you go home with a little smile on your face, confident that you really are a good person, content in your random act of kindness for the year. Of course, that person is still destitute and homeless, but it's not your job to save their life, right? To be clear, I'm not getting up on a soapbox and announcing my own moral superiority. I've done this exact same thing countless times for the exact same reasons that everyone else does. But in order to understand just how devastatingly real Spamton's story is, you have to understand the disturbingly grounded nature of his tale. Spamton is not a mad king or a tyrannical supercomputer or a demonic flower. He's a salesman. He's a normal guy. His story is completely mundane, and the suffering he undergoes is the kind of suffering that millions of real people go through every day. That's why the line that hurt me more than any other line in Spamton's story is a random piece of flavor text in the Spamton Neo boss fight. Spamton begs the audience to stop taking the furniture out of his room. Such a simple line, and yet it breaks my heart. The vision of this sad little man begging to be left with anything is just so horrible. The reason this theme hits me so hard personally is because I am devastated by the neglect that the lowest members of our society go through. It's so upsetting because it's completely avoidable. If we, as a community, wanted to solve the homeless crisis, we could do it easily. But we don't. We've got lives to live and responsibilities to uphold, and fitting in time to help out random strangers just isn't feasible. Or at least, that's what we tell ourselves. That's why the real villain of Spamton's story isn't Queen, or the Addisons, or Gaster, or anyone in particular. The real villain of Spamton's story is every single person who saw him suffering and did nothing. They didn't hurt Spamton, they just didn't help him either. It wasn't cruelty. It was the lack of kindness. They simply neglected him. And so, alone and destitute, Spamton slipped further and further into madness. This, in turn, is also what makes Spamton such a terrifying villain. It's precisely because he's not a mad king or a demonic flower that he is so unnerving. Spamton is scary because Spamton is real. You, listening at home, are extremely unlikely to encounter a cruel oligarch or a serial killer, but you are likely to encounter someone who is down on their luck. Someone whose family has disowned them and who's living out of their car. Someone who, for just being a little bit unlucky, are discarded like so much trash. Someone whose underlying mental illnesses are being intensely amplified by the uncaring society they are forced to live in. Spamton is literally just a mentally ill homeless man whose life fell apart. That's his whole origin story. And that origin story is being recreated every single day that these very real people are forced to suffer. Every day that we as a society allow people to live like dogs, we are laying the groundwork for tragedy. As long as we passively neglect the people who are suffering, we are contributing to the creation of mentally unhinged men and women with nothing to lose, just like Spamton. No single person is responsible for saving these people, but if we do nothing, we will all suffer the consequences. That is what Spamton's theme of societal neglect conveys to me. Of course, after hearing all this, you're probably feeling just a tiny bit bummed out. It probably seems like Spamton's story is just one big cruel joke in which the punchline is human nature. And for the most part, that's an accurate assessment. Between his failed search for freedom and the neglect he suffered at the hands of his own people, it's easy to conclude that there's no hope to be found in this tragedy. However, believe it or not, there is a silver lining to all this. A faint glimmer of hope that maybe, just maybe, all this pain and misery wasn't all for nothing. And that hope comes in the form of the third and final theme of Spamton's story that we will be discussing today. The theme of friendship. Now, I know you might have some instinctually cynical or sarcastic reaction to hearing me talk about the power of friendship, but this is serious, so please, take a moment to pack away all that irony and cynicism and listen with an unclouded mind. Remember when I asked you what it was the Undertale characters did correctly to earn their freedom that Spamton did incorrectly? Well, it's time to answer that question, as it is extremely important for understanding not only Spamton's story, but also one of the overarching morals of Toby Fox's work in general. You see, if I were to ask you what the main message of Undertale was, there's an above average chance that you'd say something about determination. While determination is a literal metaphysical force in these games, it's also a very intentional literary device. By having the characters with quote-unquote determination be the ones who control the destiny of the world, Toby Fox is sending a very clear message. If you have enough determination, you can accomplish almost anything. It's a message about the importance of willpower, how with enough willpower, almost any obstacle can be overcome. I avoided using the word determination when describing Spamton due to determination being a literal magical power in this setting. But make no mistake, from a character standpoint, Spamton is just as determined as any character you'd care to name. And his determination, in line with Toby Fox's worldview, definitely shows results. Even though he failed in the end, he did successfully become the most powerful being we've ever seen in this game. And the only reason he had the chance to do this is thanks to his determination. However, there's a reason that Spamton failed, and it ties back to this message. If you have enough determination, you can accomplish almost anything. The operative word here being almost. Toby Fox wants us to know the importance and power of determination, but he also wants us to know its limitations. It'll carry you a very long ways, but to achieve your wildest dreams, you'll need more than determination. And this is showcased in every single route of Undertale. In the neutral route, Omega Flowey has more determination. He's a monster beyond your comprehension. You cannot beat him. You fail. In the pacifist route, Azrael is a literal god with infinite actual power. Obviously, you cannot beat him. You fail. And in the genocide route, Sans is a reality-hopping demigod who can abuse the rules of the game to trap you in an eternal battle. You cannot beat him either. You fail. In every single timeline, there is no possible way for Frisk to win, no matter how much determination they possess. Or, to be more precise, there's no possible way for them to win alone. In every route of the game, Frisk receives aid from countless kind and friendly allies. They offer protection, guidance, companionship, and most importantly of all, friendship. And it is this that gives Frisk what they need to win. Determination carries them far, but it is only with the help of others that they can cross the finish line. Against Omega Flowey, it is only with the support and aid of the other human souls that Frisk can achieve victory. Against Azrael, when Frisk is completely overwhelmed, overpowered, and not even capable of moving their body, their only way to succeed is by saving their friends. Their friends give Frisk the strength to carry on, and it is only by literally saving your adversary, by being a real friend to Azrael, that you can achieve success. Toby Fox is so devoted to this moral, to this theme, that it even proves to be true in Genocide. That's right, even the route where you kill everyone holds this message. You cannot beat Sans. You never land a single blow on him. It's Kara who lands the killing strike, not Frisk or the player. Even in the most antisocial route of them all, it's only with the help of your partner that you can find success. Which means, hilariously, the Genocide route is about how the power of friendship, like all forms of power, can in fact be used for evil. That's how devoted Toby Fox is to getting this message across. Determination can get you a lot, but it's determination combined with the help of others that you need to achieve true success. Frisk always has determination and friendship, so they always succeed in their goal. That is what makes them different from Spamton. Spamton may have had determination in droves, but in the end, it couldn't hold a candle to someone who had determination and friends. That was Spamton's greatest weakness. That is what's at the core of Spamton's tragedy. He may have had piles of internal strength, but without the care and support of others, it amounted to nothing. But wait, I promised you a silver lining, and I wasn't lying. You see, while Spamton's life is 99% suffering and loneliness, there was one time he found real hope. One time he found real companionship. One time he found a real friend. I am, of course, talking about Chris. With Spamton's madness and Chris being a mute slave to the player, it's easy to miss the budding relationship between these two, but it's definitely there, and I feel the need to prove this fact before continuing the narrative analysis, because it's very important that you see and believe that this bond between them really exists in order for this narrative to fully hit home. Spamton instantly understands Chris's plight and repeatedly emphasizes how similar they are. The entire first fight with Spamton isn't really a fight. It's a sales pitch, with Spamton trying to convince Chris that his plan to achieve freedom has merit. I believe that's why Spamton has this moment where he literally heals you to full health if you need it. He doesn't actually want to hurt you. He wants to make a deal and judge Chris's character. When Chris shows up at his shop later, Chris tells Susie and Rouse to wait outside. This is notable because it's not something we order Chris to do. It's just something they do of their own volition. And I think it's because they want to respect Spamton's wish that they come alone. Spamton is overjoyed that Chris came, and when asking about friends, Spamton insists that he and Chris are already good friends. Spamton still hates the world for what it did to him, which is why he says they don't need anyone else, but from this point onwards, Spamton fully intends to help Chris gain freedom. When becoming Neo, although Spamton acts very intimidating and threatening and fully intends to kill Chris, it's not out of malice. He really does think that absorbing Chris's soul will be what's best for both of them. While we technically don't know how the soul mechanics work in Deltarune, in Undertale, having your soul absorbed didn't mean you were dead. It actually meant that you shared a body with whoever absorbed you, which is what we see with Azriel and Kara, and given this line from Spamton, in which he begs Chris to become a part of his heart, I'd say it seems likely that souls function similarly here. At the very least, Spamton believes they do, and he demonstrates this throughout his dialogue during the Spamton-Neo battle. Just like in his first fight, this battle isn't really about fighting as much as it is about Spamton trying to convince Chris that this is a good plan. It's another sales pitch, and as is appropriate for a sales pitch, Spamton repeatedly emphasizes how this will allow both of them to see into heaven, to gain freedom, and to become big shots. Spamton promises that if Chris accepts this deal, he will literally give Chris everything he has. And if the mechanics of soul absorption are the same as in Undertale, then that seems very likely to be true. Spamton would literally be giving Chris partial control over his body, which is an extremely generous thing for Spamton to do when you remember that his whole story is about gaining freedom, and yet he's willing to give Chris power over him. Even Spamton's theme music supports the existence of this relationship. Now's your chance to be a big shot. Spamton's music is literally him offering freedom to Chris. Make no mistake, Spamton is deranged, and he is a threat to himself and others, but at his core, I am convinced that he really does want to help Chris. He really is trying to do right by his friend. And I think Chris's reactions during all this further support this interpretation of their relationship. When Chris first gets knocked back by Spamton, notice how they don't even try to get back up. They don't pull their sword, they don't try to run away, and they don't even raise their shield. Even after being rescued by Susie and Rouse, Chris stays on the ground. And when Spamton sends the floating heads to try and attack them, notice that Chris is still just kneeling on the ground. They aren't trying to defend themselves. Sure, their soul emerges to try and shoot back at the Spamton heads, but that's almost certainly not something Chris is choosing to do. In both chapter endings, we repeatedly see it shown that the soul is more identified with the player than it is with Chris, as Chris will literally go off on their own to do what they please. This is further supported by the fact that we have to press the button to shoot in this sequence. Chris has nothing to do with it. Honestly, there is an argument to be made that Chris was actually willing to go along with Spamton's plan. They don't fight back at all until we force them to. Rouse and Susie assumed Chris needed help, but for all we know, Chris wanted this to happen. And their reaction after the Neo battle further supports them caring about Spamton, as they are visibly upset by the whole ordeal. Chris is a very taciturn character, so the instances in which their emotions are strong enough for other characters to notice are pretty rare. One such instance being in Chapter 1, when Chris is visibly angered when Monster Kid trash talks Susie. Chris doesn't appreciate people disrespecting their friends. And I'd argue that something very similar is happening here. They are visibly shaken, and when asked if they're okay, they yell no if we let them. Chris never showed this level of emotion after any of the life-threatening situations they'd been through, which says to me that it's specifically because of their relationship with Spamton that this situation upset them so much. I think Chris really does care about him. And while the Chris side of this friendship is hard to prove, the Spamton side is pretty much undeniable. Spamton fully believes he and Chris are real friends, and this is never better demonstrated than at the end of their battle in the pacifist route. Upon realizing that Chris hasn't been attacking him directly, but has instead been cutting his wires, Spamton immediately assumes that this is Chris trying to set him free. Even now, after everything, Spamton really does believe that Chris has his best interest at heart. He really does think that he and Chris are on the same team, and that they both want to win freedom for each other. As a result, Spamton declares triumphantly that he is now ready, after all this time, to live not just for himself, but for the sake of his friend as well. With the evidence of their friendship laid out, we can get back to the narrative analysis, and can I just say, this is one of the saddest, yet most heartfelt friendships I've ever seen. With Chris being this standoffish teenager who normally seems so cold, and Spamton being this mentally deranged old man, seeing these two characters find empathy and camaraderie in their shared struggles is strangely wholesome. It kind of reminds me of the relationship between Ice King and Marceline from Adventure Time, with Spamton's mental illness making him dangerous and hard to be around, but with Chris still caring for him like a beloved uncle whose mind just isn't all there anymore. And it's in this relationship, in this bond, that I believe the silver lining of Spamton's story is to be found. It's in their friendship that Spamton finds redemption. As I said earlier, one of the main morals of Toby Fox's work is that determination alone will carry you far, but friendship is what you need to reach true success. And I think he intentionally wrote Spamton's story to reflect that. Spamton spent potentially decades desperately trying to break into the Queen's mansion, only for it to always end in failure. And yet, when he finally makes a single real friend in Chris, he achieves all his wildest dreams in a single day. He goes from living in a dumpster to becoming a mechanical demigod in a single afternoon. And it's all thanks to Chris. They found in each other someone who could understand their plight. As far as we know, Spamton is the only character to realize what's happening to Chris, as he literally calls them a heart on a chain, with an otherworldly entity controlling them. So imagine Chris's relief at someone not only understanding their situation, but also actively trying to help Chris escape their bondage. There's something so sad about the idea of Chris only finding someone who can truly understand them in the form of a man who can barely form a coherent sentence. And while the Chris side of this story is more depressing than anything, the Spamton side has an aura of hope and relief to it. Chris is still in the midst of their tragic tale, so they get no relief after defeating Spamton. If anything, they're suffering even more now. But for Spamton, this was the best time of his life. He not only was achieving his goals, but more importantly, he wasn't alone anymore. The one thing that everyone in his world had denied him, friendship, Chris had given him. He doesn't have to live for just himself anymore. And while he ultimately fails in his quest, I think the reason this is the failure that ultimately does him in and causes him to give up isn't because his spirit was broken or his determination ran out. I think it's because, for the first time in his life, he doesn't have to fight this battle alone anymore. Spamton's story is about a simple man with a simple goal: to gain freedom. In the search of that goal, he does everything society tells him to, only for everyone to turn on him out of petty jealousy and cold-hearted neglect. He spent ages alone in the dump, his fractured heart seething with bitterness at the world that had discarded him as his mind fell into shambles. His perseverance, rather than earning him victory, only served to prolong his suffering. And yet, despite all this, in the final leg of his journey, in the 11th hour of his life, he found a glimmer of hope, a spark of kindness, generosity, and support from a true kindred spirit. As he lay there, strung up in the strings of his own creation, having failed for the final time, a moment of clarity and self-reflection came over him. He had failed once again, and yet he didn't feel the need to get back up. He didn't feel the need to continue the struggle, because now he knew someone else would carry on the fight. Like a forgotten soldier fueled by spite and rage and left on duty for years in a never-ending war, Spamton was tired of the fighting. And Chris, without even realizing it, was giving him permission to stop. Permission to lay down his sword. They would carry on the struggle for freedom. He could finally rest. At any other time in his life, Spamton would have clawed his way back from this failure, more wounded and fractured than ever in his desperate, lonely quest. But not this time. This time, for the first time, he had someone he could lean on. With his final spoken line, Spamton passes on what power he has to Chris. He had failed to find his own freedom, but that's okay. because he could still find some peace of mind by helping Chris find their freedom. When Jevil was defeated, he turned into an item, just like Spamton, and he described this process as being akin to a deep sleep. I'd like to think that Spamton, after such a long, cruel, lonely life, has finally found a place he can call home. I hope he's sleeping peacefully in the company of his one true friend. And with that, we've reached the end of my analysis. I hope you enjoyed this dive into the themes and narrative of Spamton. Naturally, there are plenty of ways you can look at Spamton's story that I did not personally focus on, like the inherent critique of capitalism, or how he demonstrates the way we demonize and alienate the downtrodden members of society. But I think I covered the most important themes of this story with regards to the overarching narrative that Toby Fox wants to tell. The societal neglect theme was of especial importance to me personally, so I hope that section effectively communicated my feelings. Remember that this is only the first part of the Spamton analysis series, so if you enjoyed this, then make sure to subscribe to see future discussions on this sad, strange little man. Next video, I will be analyzing every possible meaning of hyperlink blocked, so you'll definitely want to check that out. And of course, I'd like to thank my patrons, whose generosity is of real help during these difficult times. Student loan debts and medical bills are a constant boogeyman, so y'all helping out with this is extremely appreciated. A special thanks go out to Lil Nyrus X, Umbra, E-Roll, and Ray. Your support means more than you could know. That's it for the video, but before I bid you farewell, we've got some fan art to look at. First up is this lovely piece depicting Chris immediately after stabbing Azrael, and I really like this. The background details hinting at Ralsei and the Dark World are great, the effect of Azrael disintegrating is really well done, and Chris just looks cute as a button. Very nice work, very cute art. I believe this is your first fan art, if I'm not mistaken, so welcome aboard. Your art and your support mean the world to me. Next is another piece by the same artist depicting Ralsei chilling with Flowey, and this is also just really good. Ralsei is looking cute as always, and it's really nice to see Flowey again. Since most of my fan art is Deltarune oriented, we don't see Flowey super often, so thank you very much for this contribution. The dark fountain in the background also makes for a very nice backdrop. The next two pieces do come with a content warning, as they do depict blood, so if you'd like to skip these, I'll put a timestamp on screen right now. Skip to that point to get past the blood. Alright, here we go. This piece is also from a new artist, so welcome aboard, love to see you, and more importantly, look at this gorgeous art! We see Chris here after stabbing Azrael with their knife, covered in blood, because, as we established in my Sans theory, Deltarune monsters do in fact have blood, so this actually makes a lot of sense. Chris looks really freaked out, and can I say, doing all this on pen and paper is really impressive. You are very talented. But wait, it gets even better. Look at this! This is so freaking impressive. We've got a drawing of Ralsei in the back, but more importantly, we have this crazy high-resolution depiction of Chris looking at their crying reflection in their bloody knife. Wow, this is incredible. And again, this is on pen and paper. You're unbelievably talented. The hyper-realistic yellow hands at the bottom also just really sell how absurdly high-detailed this art is, and I'm really blown away. Awesome work. Thank you so much for sharing. Alright, content warning for blood is now over, and content warning for epicness is now in effect. Look at this piece of absolute perfection. Talking about seeing into heaven, holy God. I love it. Susie looks so gosh darn epic and beautiful and stylish. The tail highlights are such a brilliant touch, and giving her dragon horns is just perfect. But wait, there's more. We've got a sprite of this version of Susie from the same artist, and here we see the dragon motif fully realized, with big ol' wings and a tail. The jacket being all torn up, the axe on her back, the gold heart on her belt, and her hair having highlights is all just so awesome. Very cool work. But wait, we've got one more mind-boggling piece from this artist. Look at that. Look at that. Look at that. This is me. This is me real life. I'd actually scream if I wasn't worried about peaking my microphone. I don't even know where to begin. Her boots, her jeans, her belt buckle, her epic torn jacket, her badass dragon wings and tail, her massive freaking axe, her horns, and best of all, the massive tsunami of gorgeous hair. Look at that. Her hair is amazing. I'm going to pass out. I cannot cope with how dope this is. You are a master at your craft, and you honor me far more than I deserve by making this. God bless you. Next, we have yet another new artist with a piece depicting Chris in front of Flowey. Man, we get no Flowey for so long, and then suddenly we get multiple. I'm not complaining. This is awesome. We've got Omega Flowey in the background. We've got regular Flowey down below. We've got Chris wearing an Azrael-inspired version of their Dark World outfit. And best of all, we've got Chris's soul with Azrael's soul inside it, as well as the shadowy outline of Azrael's head just behind Chris. Awesome work. I love Azrael in all his many interesting forms, so seeing so many of them assembled here is quite cool. Thank you for the art. Next, we have this intensely funny and awesome piece depicting Chris and Susie with their color palettes swapped. For those who don't know the context, I was having some fun on Twitter by making palette-swapped versions of various Deltarune characters, and one of the most popular was this swap of Susie and Chris's Light World color palettes. And of course, Eska's Art, in their wisdom and genius, decided to do fan art of it. Thank you so much for making this. Your art style is always a delight to see. Next, we have another piece by Grizzly Teddy, with this piece providing some backstory as to why Chris did the Snowgrave route. Turns out, trash-talking Azrael not only irritates Chris, but also irritates the soul of Azrael dwelling inside Chris. This is a pretty fantastic and deep cut with regards to my theories, as in my Rousey theory, I basically argued that Azrael, not Chris, is responsible for Snowgrave, so this is a pretty hilarious explanation for why Azrael did it. Great work, really funny, and your art style is really fun as well. Next, we have another palette swap fan art, with this one coming from the #1 Rousey supplier on Twitter.com. This fan art, as you can see, was of the Dark World palette swap I did of Susie and Chris, and I really enjoy this. Not only does Susie just look sick in general, love the pink highlights, but Chris looks really cool as well. The gold armor is such a nice addition and makes Chris look like a brand new epic character. Very cool stuff and a very cute art style. If you guys at home ever feel in the need for a mountain of Rousey fan art, make sure to check this person out on Twitter. They have a surplus. Next is the latest addition to the insanely good Sans comic we saw in a previous video. This time, we have Sans discovering the remains of Papyrus as the Titans stomp around in the distance and the Delta Warriors begin to approach. Incredible work, as always. This artist, whose name I will definitely mispronounce if I try to read it, is very quickly becoming one of my favorite artists of all time. Between the Sans comic and the epic Susie art, you have clearly proven yourself to be a versatile and masterful practitioner of your craft. Thank you so much for sharing. We will always be delighted to see you here. Next, we have this awesome piece from another new artist, and there's so much to unpack here. The overall premise of this is, what if my angel theory was true, and what would it look like in the Snowgrave route? So to realize that, we've got Chris in bronze armor wielding a rapier, possibly the twisted sword. We've got Noelle doing Snowgrave, and we've got Dragon Susie as well. And of course, we've got this really cool depiction of the angel. The blurry, holy aura of the angel is a really cool touch and helps add to the intensity of this entity. The background dark fountain also makes for an epic backdrop. And of course, the whole piece takes on a comical tone when you see the dialogue being spoken by Chris. Get that mother father! Unfortunately, the artist seems to have spilled milk or something on the word, so the father part of mother father has been blurred out, but we can still tell what they're trying to say, so it works out. It's very nice of them to use a gender-inclusive term like mother father as well. Very progressive. I didn't realize the angel was gender fluid. Stupid joke. Stupid joke. Thank you so much for the art. You're quite talented. Next, we have this awesome animation of Oberon Smog getting the drop on the Fun Gang, and holy cow, is this epic! Look at this. It's so freaking cool. This art style, this design for Oberon, and the sheer coolness of this is just awesome. This artist also had a few other contributions as well. We first have this awesome piece with so much awesome details going on here. The Fun Gang look great and have some fun details, with Susie having her dragon wings, Chris having red horns, Spamton's glasses, and Jevel's tail, and Rousey having a golden flower in his hair. But even better than that is Oberon Smog, who looks scary and epic as all get out. The chest plate and armor designs are great, but my favorite detail has to be the pink hair. This is so freaking cool and is one of my favorite design elements of Oberon. He has pink hair, for those who don't know, because he's supposed to be a younger Gerson, and the working theory is that Gerson had pink hair just like Alvin in his younger years. Awesome work. And the third piece from this artist is a sprite sheet. We've got sprite versions of the Fun Gang and Oberon, but we've also got Sans jumping into his reality hopping machine while also showcasing the Mystery Man fused heads. Great work here. And having the strange machine be the Mr. Saturn machine from one of the Mother games is a great detail. Awesome work all around. Thank you so much for sharing. Needless to say, you are talented as all get out, and it was an honor getting the chance to show off your work. Next, we have a couple sprite edits from another new artist, this one being that of W. Pizza Pants Gaster. I think this is sprouting from the joke I made at one point that since we don't know Pizza Pants' real name, he could easily turn out to be some secretly important character like Yaster. So this is a really funny combination of the two characters. This artist also made this, showcasing what they think the angel will look like. I love how huge it is. The rainbow wings are a nice Asriel callback, and the tiger head is so random but so awesome at the same time. Very cool. Thank you so much for sharing. Next, we have a depiction of the true Gaster, inspired by the theory in my Sans video, and I quite enjoy this. It's not easy to make a face like that look threatening, but you pull it off. The dark aura and mysterious wingding message are also very nice touches. Very cool. Thank you for sharing. Next, we have a couple meme thumbnail edits, including this Jaru versus Yaster one that is very sweet and very silly. Also, there's this Spamton thumbnail that's quite the fun little collage. Very nice. I'll probably have my own thumbnail for when I analyze Spamton's dialogue, but it's still very cool to see my fans coming up with their own. Thank you very much for submitting. Next, we have yet another new artist, and they submitted 15 separate pieces of art that collectively tell the story of my Sans theory. So hold on to your butts, because I'm going to show them all. We've got Sans and Papyrus encountering the Titans. Papyrus then gets stomped by one of the Titans, very sad. Sans falls to his knees in dismay. Sans then comes up with a plan to save Papyrus. He then encounters the Delta Warriors. He then explains his plan to them. We then get this collage reiterating one of my lines about how much these kids had overcome. Sans then rushes to the strange machine. The heroes confront the angel to slow it down. Sans then gets flung across time and space. The angel then triggers the reset. Sans starts to lose his memories, so he quickly sketches a super sad and cute drawing of the Fun Gang. And then we get to my favorite part, where Sans finds out that the Undertale reality is stuck in a time loop too, and he doesn't take the news very well. Holy cow. Thank you so freaking much for this epic and extensive art project. I really like how this managed to be sad and funny at the same time, and I can't imagine how much work this must have taken. Incredible stuff. Thank you so much. I am deeply flattered. And lastly, we have 2 more pieces from a new artist. We've just had a ton of new artists today, with the first one being a depiction of Gaster based off the bottom half of the Mystery Man sprite, which looks very cool. Pen and paper stuff is always impressive, so thank you for blessing me with your art. Again, I'm really impressed with you artists managing to turn that goofy-looking sprite into something believably intimidating. Great work. And last but not least, we have a collection of various Gaster sketches, which all look quite cool. Pen and paper stuff, as I will always say, is impressive. So thank you for blessing us all with your art. And that wraps up the fan art section. You guys are truly incredible, and I will never stop being honored at receiving such awesome stuff. And with that, I believe it's time to bring this video to a close. Like if you enjoyed the video, comment if you've got something to say, subscribe if you want to see more, and as always, have a fantastic day.